It was never supposed to mean anything. I had never been the kind of person who got caught up in labels or expectations. My life was simple by design: work, friends, a few drinks on the weekends, the occasional casual fling. No attachments. No one to worry about but myself. Relationships? Too much effort. Too much room for complications, for messiness, for getting caught in something I couldn't control. I had spent too many nights listening to friends cry over people who never cared as much as they did, watched them fall apart over someone who walked away like it was nothing. I had sworn that would never be me. So I stayed in control. Always. And then I met Ava. It was a hot Friday night in Los Angeles, the kind where the city buzzed with a restless energy, where the air itself felt electric, thick with possibility. The streets pulsed with movement, people spilling out of rooftop bars, neon lights flickering against the pavement, the distant hum of laughter and music echoing from every corner. Anything could happen on a night like that. I was at a bar in West Hollywood, tucked into a red leather booth with a few friends, half listening to someone complain about their ex while I sipped my drink. The ice had melted, watering down the burn of the alcohol, but I wasn't really paying attention to that either. And then she walked in. Ava. I didn't notice her at first, not until the conversation at my table faded into the background and my eyes landed on her. She had that kind of presence, the kind that made the air shift the moment she stepped into a room. It wasn't just her looks, though those were impossible to ignore. Sun-kissed skin, high cheekbones, full lips that curved into a slow, knowing smile. She moved with effortless confidence, with a kind of deliberate ease, like she knew exactly how much space she took up in the world and didn't care if it made people stare. And she was staring at me. I felt it before I even turned my head. That pull, the unmistakable weight of someone's gaze settling on you. When our eyes met, a flicker of amusement passed through hers, like she had already figured me out before I even had the chance to speak. I should have looked away. I didn't. Instead, I let her come to me. The first words we exchanged didn't matter. Maybe it was about the music, maybe it was a joke about the overpriced cocktails, maybe it was something completely meaningless, because the words themselves weren't what hooked me. It was the way she said them. Low and smooth, like every sentence she spoke was meant to be a secret. Like she was testing to see if I'd lean in closer. And I did. She had this way of speaking that made everything sound like an invitation, like she was daring me to fall into whatever this was, to forget the rules I had set for myself. The drinks kept coming. The distance between us disappeared. I don't know who touched who first, but suddenly, there were fingertips grazing my wrist, a warm palm resting on my knee, her laugh brushing against my skin. I wasn't the type to be thrown off balance. But Ava? She made me feel lightheaded. Like I was floating, like the whole world had blurred into the background, like none of my rules mattered anymore. And then, at some point, between the teasing glances and the way she ran her tongue along the rim of her glass before taking a sip, we stopped pretending this was just small talk. We left the bar together. I don't remember who suggested it. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was me. Maybe it didn't matter, because by the time we stumbled into my apartment, it was already inevitable. It was supposed to be simple. A night, nothing more. I had done this before, casual, easy, no strings attached. I knew how this worked. But even then, as she kissed me against the door, as her fingers dragged down my spine, as I pulled her closer, like I already knew what she felt like beneath my hands, I should have known. Nothing with Ava was ever going to be simple. The first thing that went wrong was time. Because Ava didn't leave the next morning. That should have been my first clue, my first warning sign. I was used to how these things worked, the unspoken rules of casual nights that didn't stretch into messy mornings. The polite but firm goodbye. The half smile at the door. The fading scent of perfume on my pillows long after they were gone. But Ava? She didn't follow any of the rules. I woke up to the smell of coffee, the sound of soft music humming from my kitchen speaker. For a few disoriented seconds, I thought I was alone, that maybe the scent had been left behind in the fabric of my sheets, that maybe I had just imagined her presence lingering in my apartment. Then I walked into the kitchen and saw her. She was standing by the counter, one of my oversized t-shirts hanging loose on her frame, far too comfortable in a space that wasn't hers. She looked up when she heard me, her lips curling into something infuriatingly familiar, like she had been waiting for me to wake up, like she had been here 100 times before. "Morning, stranger," she said, lifting her coffee mug in a lazy cheers.
I should have said something.
Should have asked why she was still here, should have made it clear that this wasn't how I did things. But instead, I just stood there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her like an idiot while she moved around my kitchen like she belonged there. "Didn't think you'd still be here," I finally managed, my voice rough from sleep. Ava just shrugged, taking a slow sip of coffee. "Didn't seem like you were in a hurry to kick me out. And that was the problem. It wasn't just breakfast. It was the way she lingered. After coffee, it was a cigarette on my balcony. The two of us leaning against the railing, watching the city stretch out in front of us like it belonged to only us. The conversation was easy, too easy, dipping into topics I usually kept at arm's length. Then, before I could stop it, coffee turned into brunch. And brunch turned into a slow afternoon in my apartment, music playing low in the background, sunlight spilling through the windows. She laughed at my bookshelves, at the half-finished novels stacked on my nightstand. She stole my socks because she didn't like walking around barefoot. She sat cross-legged on my couch, completely at home in a space that wasn't hers, flipping through TV channels like she was waiting for something to catch her attention. By the time I finally looked at the clock again, it was Sunday night, and she was still here, sitting on my couch, wearing my clothes, one arm slung over the back of the cushions, remote in hand. She caught me staring, raising an eyebrow in amusement. "You okay over there?" And that's when it hit me. I didn't want her to leave, and that was more terrifying than anything else. "This isn't weird to you?" I asked, breaking the silence. Ava didn't even glance at me. She just kept her eyes on the TV, flipping through channels like the conversation was the most casual thing in the world. "What isn't?" I frowned. "You're still here. We barely know each other." That finally got a reaction. She turned her head toward me, one side of her mouth curling into something unreadable, something challenging. And that's not usually how this works," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. I wasn't even sure if I believed them anymore. Ava tilted her head, watching me. "What if we want to know each other?" I blinked. "Want." It was such a simple word, but the way she said it, the weight she put behind it, made something twist in my stomach. It wasn't just about now, about the way she had stayed when she should have left. It was about something else, something bigger. Something I didn't let myself think about. So I said nothing. And that was my second mistake. The real problem started Monday morning, because I walked into the office, still off balance from the weekend, still thinking about her, about the way she had laughed at my playlists, about the way she had looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. And then I saw her, standing in the middle of the conference room, surrounded by my coworkers, her posture easy, her smile devastatingly self-assured. And when her gaze finally found mine across the room, something flickered in her expression. A hint of amusement. A secret between us that no one else in that office knew. But the real punch to the gut came when she turned back to the room and said, "I'm looking forward to working with all of you." A pause. "My name is Ava, and I'll be your new creative director. My new boss." My stomach dropped. And then, just to make things worse, she turned back to me and smiled. Like this was all part of her plan. If it had been hard to keep things under control before, now it was impossible. The shift had been subtle at first, woven into the routine of office life in ways that only I seemed to notice. But once it started, it was like a crack in the foundation, small, almost imperceptible, until suddenly everything was collapsing. Meetings turned into silent games, where every glance across the conference table carried too much weight, where every offhand remark felt like it had layers of meaning beneath the surface. Conversations that should have been professional carried an edge, a careful tension that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. I told myself it didn't matter, that I could compartmentalize, that we were adults, that we could separate whatever that weekend had been from the reality of work. But then came the late nights. The after-hours dinners where a table between us felt like a flimsy barrier, where wine softened the edges of restraint, where the way she looked at me made it impossible to remember that we weren't alone. The first time her hand brushed mine reaching for the same folder, I barely breathed. The second time, I didn't pull away. And when she leaned in one evening, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath against my skin as she corrected something on my report, I realized something dangerous. I didn't want to stop this. It all came to a head on a night that should have been like any other. The office was nearly empty, the last remnants of conversation fading as people filtered out into the night. I was still at my desk, staring blankly at my computer screen, pretending to focus on anything but her. Ava was in the glass-walled conference room, deep in a conversation with another executive. I wasn't watching. Not really. But my body still tensed every time she laughed, every time she ran a hand through her hair, every time she existed in my periphery. I needed to leave. I needed distance. But before I could, she was standing at my desk. "Dinner," she said, like it wasn't a question, like it was inevitable. I hesitated, staring at the words glowing on my screen, trying to remember what excuse I had used the last time. But when I glanced up, she was watching me with that same unshakable confidence, like she already knew my answer. And the worst part?
She did. Dinner turned into wine.
Wine turned into an argument. Not a real fight, not anger, but something sharp, something alive, something charged with a frustration that had nothing to do with the ad campaign we were supposedly discussing. "You're impossible," I muttered, setting my glass down with more force than necessary. Ava smirked. "And yet, you're still here." I exhaled through my nose, not trusting myself to answer. Because she was right. Of course she was right. I should have walked away weeks ago. I should have set boundaries. I should have ended this before it ever began. Instead, I was following her out of the restaurant, into the dim glow of the parking lot, my pulse a mess beneath my skin. Then, before I could even register it, her hand was on my wrist, firm but not forceful, guiding me into the shadows between the cars. The city noise hummed around us, the air warm from the leftover heat of the day, but all I could focus on was her. Ava stepped closer, and I let her. "You know what I think?" she murmured, tilting her head slightly, her gaze flickering between my lips and my eyes. I swallowed hard.
"What?"
Her fingers traced the inside of my wrist, slow and deliberate, sending an undeniable shiver down my spine. "I think," she said, her voice lower now, "that you like this more than you're willing to admit." My breath caught. "That you like the game," she continued, her fingers still barely touching me, making my entire body ache for something I couldn't name. "That you like pretending you're in control, when we both know you're not." I opened my mouth, ready to argue, ready to throw something, anything, back at her. But then she leaned in just a fraction more, her lips almost grazing my cheek. "Tell me," she whispered, "that it was just one night." My heart slammed against my ribs. "Ava." "Tell me," she repeated, her breath warm against my skin, "and I'll stop." I should have said it. The words were right there, on the tip of my tongue, waiting to save me. To pull me back to safety, to the version of myself that didn't get caught up in things like this, that didn't let emotions tangle with logic. But I didn't say it. I didn't say anything at all. And in that moment, I knew I had already lost the game. Everything fell apart too fast. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, the warning signs had been everywhere. The lingering looks, the barely there touches, the way my pulse reacted whenever she was close. Maybe we had been careful at first. Maybe we had told ourselves that nobody could see, that we were in control. But in an office like ours, secrets were currency, and the smallest slip could start a fire we couldn't put out. And that's exactly what happened. The whispers started first. A glance that lasted a second too long during a meeting. A casual touch, a hand on the small of my back, a brush of fingers against my wrist. That should have gone unnoticed, but didn't. An energy that existed between us that was impossible to ignore, no matter how hard we tried. Then came the rumors. Someone must have seen something. Maybe it was the way she looked at me when she thought nobody was paying attention. Maybe it was the way I leaned in just a little too close when we spoke in hushed voices in the hallway. Maybe it was the way I stopped pretending I wasn't completely and utterly caught up in her. Whatever it was enough. Enough to reach the wrong ears. Enough to become an issue. Enough to get us both pulled into an office with a tight-lipped HR rep, forced to sit through a painfully formal conversation about maintaining professionalism in leadership positions and avoiding potential power imbalances in the workplace. Ava sat next to me through it all, her expression calm, composed, like she had prepared for this, like she had spent hours rehearsing what to say. But I saw it in her eyes. The exhaustion. The weight of it all pressing down on her. She was holding on by a thread. And I didn't know how much longer she could take it. The call came late in the afternoon. Ava's name flashed across my screen, and even before I picked up, I knew. Something was about to change. When I stepped into her office, the blinds were drawn, the usual flood of sunlight replaced by a dim, muted glow. She stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest, gaze fixed on something outside, something I couldn't see. She didn't turn around when I closed the door. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, finally, she exhaled, a slow, heavy breath that carried more than just exhaustion. "This," she said, voice low. "This is out of control." My throat tightened. I knew it was true. We had been pushing the limits for weeks, ignoring the inevitable consequences, pretending like we could exist in this impossible space between what was allowed and what we wanted. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. That was all it took for her to finally turn around and look at me. And it was in that moment, that one unbearable second, that I realized what she was about to ask. And I wasn't ready for it. "Do we stop this?" Her voice was steady, but I could hear the strain underneath. She wanted me to say yes. To make it easy. To give her an out. A reason to step back before this spiraled further. Before one of us got hurt. Before we lost more than we were willing to sacrifice. It would have been the logical answer. The smart answer. I could have said it. Should have said it. But the words never came. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to pretend that I could go back to how things were before. I didn't want to erase the way she made me feel, the way she looked at me like I was something she didn't know how to handle but couldn't stay away from.
So I said nothing.
And she just watched me, waiting, hoping, dreading. Until finally, she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Defeated. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, shaking her head. "I don't even know if I want to." That was the closest thing to the truth she had given me yet. But instead of answering, instead of trying to convince her that we didn't need to fix anything, I just turned and walked out of her office, leaving the door open behind me. Because if she wanted to stop this, if she really wanted to let go, she'd have to be the one to close it. That night, my apartment had never felt emptier. I sat on the couch, staring at nothing, my mind playing and replaying the moment in her office, the way she had looked at me like she was trying to decide whether to run or to stay. For so long, I had built my life around logic, control, distance. I had avoided attachment, avoided situations that could turn messy, avoided people who could make me feel this much. But Ava changed all of that. And now, as I sat there, staring at the untouched glass of wine on the table, feeling the absence of her next to me like a phantom weight, I realized something. I didn't want logic. I didn't want control. I wanted her. And for the first time in my life, I was willing to see where that would take me. Even if it meant letting everything else fall apart.